Building on our previous discussion of the foundational principles of cognitive biology, let's delve into how these principles give rise to something truly remarkable: consciousness itself. We're starting with the basics, the raw materials. Imagine your brain has two main maps. First, there's the map of you, your body, your internal state, your gut feelings, your balance, all represented in various brain regions. Let's call this the proto-self map. Then, there's the map of whatever object you're interacting with: a face, a sound, a texture, captured in your sensory and motor areas. Both are just patterns of neural activity, first-order maps. Now, here's the crucial bit. When you interact with that object, say, you touch something hot, the object's representation starts messing with your proto-self map. Your hand feels pain, your heart rate might spike. This interaction isn't just passive, it actively changes the map of your own organism. And guess what? The brain doesn't just stop there. It creates another layer of mapping, a second-order map, specifically to represent this relationship: how the object caused a change in your proto-self. These second-order maps are where the magic begins to happen. So, we have these second-order maps tracking the relationship between you and the world. Why does this feel like anything? Because remember, both the map of you, the proto-self, and the map of the relationship are fundamentally tied to your body. They're not abstract symbols floating in space. When the brain generates an image from those second-order maps, what you get is a feeling. It's the feeling of being affected by the object, the feeling of knowing something is happening to you because of it. Now, before you ask how any neural pattern becomes an image, that's a huge question. The first problem of consciousness we touched on earlier. We're focusing on the second problem. How does this process create a sense of self? The key player here is the proto-self, the brain's ongoing, unconscious representation of your organism's state. Think of it as the raw data feed about your body. The core idea is that every time you encounter something, your brain rapidly constructs a nonverbal story, a narrative, about how this object is interacting with and changing your proto-self. It's like a tiny internal movie playing out, showing the object and the resulting changes in you. And this storytelling doesn't stop, it's incessant. As long as your brain is switched on, it's constantly generating these narratives. Why? Because there's always something coming in: sights, sounds, smells, tactile sensations, or even things pulled up from memory. There's no shortage of objects, real or recalled, to trigger this process. So, you can never run out of this basic commodity called core consciousness. These narrative images aren't separate from the main event. They flow alongside the images of the object you're processing. Think of it like shadows accompanying the main characters in a film. They're part of the scene, providing context, enhancing the drama. There's no external director watching this internal play. Now, what are the immediate payoffs of this constant storytelling? Two big ones. First, you get that subtle, fleeting sense of knowing, the feeling that you are the one experiencing this. Second, the object that caused the change gets highlighted, its image enhanced in your mind. Your attention naturally focuses on it, making it stand out against other potential distractions. It becomes the salient fact of the moment. So why do we feel conscious? Why do we know we are conscious? It's because this internal narrative makes us the protagonist. The story depicts a character, you, engaging with the world and having a reaction. You rise above the background noise of mere knowing and become a felt core self, a temporary entity aware of its own awareness. This core self is incredibly transient, popping up and vanishing again with each new stimulus or memory recall. But it's incessant, constantly renewed. Knowing itself springs to life within this narrative structure. It's inherent in the pattern of neurons firing to tell that story. Sometimes you barely notice it, maybe catching a whisper of a verbal translation like, "Yes, it's me seeing this." But sometimes it hits you full force. T.S. Eliot nailed it, didn't he? You are the music while the music lasts. That fleeting moment of deep knowing, of union with the experience, is precisely what this core self represents. And critically, if this internal storytelling mechanism breaks down due to neurological issues, consciousness itself goes offline. The difference is monumental. Okay, so this core self is fleeting, like a bubble. But something does last. In complex organisms like us, with our massive memory systems, these moments of discovering our existence can be stored. We build up autobiographical memory, a collection of records about who we've been physically, behaviorally, and who we plan to be. Think of it as a library of personal history. When we bring certain parts of this library to mind, reconstructing them as vivid images, that's when the autobiographical self emerges. It's the conscious sense of me grounded in our past experiences. What's truly remarkable, according to this hypothesis, is how this autobiographical memory is architecturally linked to both the unconscious proto-self and the conscious core self. It acts as a bridge, connecting the ever-changing, moment-to-moment core consciousness to the stable, rock-solid facts of our unique biography. It enriches our momentary core self with the context of who we are, where we came from, what we like, our name, the critical events that shaped us. This autobiographical self is more conceptually rich and open to change over time compared to the relatively fixed core self mechanism. Let's quickly summarize the difference between these two selves. The core self is the transient hero of the immediate moment, generated whenever any object interacts with your proto-self. It's the feeling of knowing right now. It relies on the basic machinery of core consciousness. The autobiographical self, on the other hand, is built from the accumulated records of your life, your autobiographical memory. It's the conscious awareness of who you are across time, based on concepts of identity. It requires the existence of core consciousness to be accessed and experienced, because each memory recall needs that core self pulse to make sense. Think of the core self as the engine running constantly, and the autobiographical self as the detailed map of the territory you've already explored, which you can consult while driving. The core self is primordial, implicit. The autobiographical self is explicit, conceptual. How exactly is this core consciousness assembled? The proposal here is that it happens in pulses. Each pulse corresponds to an interaction with an object, whether it's something you see, hear, touch, or recall. A pulse starts just before the object starts affecting your proto-self and ends when a new object takes over. The modified proto-self then becomes the starting point for the next object's pulse. The feeling of continuous consciousness, then, comes not from one single uninterrupted stream, but from the incredibly rapid overlapping generation of these consciousness pulses fueled by the endless stream of objects our brains process. And it's likely not just one narrative at a time. You can often juggle multiple objects simultaneously, and each might involve different levels of brain processing. So, multiple second-order narratives could be running in parallel. This redundancy ensures an overabundance of core consciousness, guaranteeing that the feeling of knowing is almost always present. Okay, so we need a dedicated system to tell this story of the object changing the self. Just having separate maps for the object and the self isn't enough. We need a mechanism that can take information from both and synthesize it into a representation of their relationship. This requires a second-order neural pattern. Think of it as needing a special kind of processor that takes inputs about the initial state of the self, the arrival of the object, and the final state of the self after the interaction, and puts them together in a meaningful sequence. It's not likely a single brain region holds this supreme pattern. Just like coordinating complex movements involves many different brain areas working in concert, this higher function probably relies on intricate cross-signaling among several specialized second-order structures. The brain loves distributed processing for complex tasks. What would these hypothetical second-order structures need to do? 4 key things. First, they need inputs, pathways connecting them to areas representing the proto-self and potential objects. Second, they need to generate a pattern that captures the sequence of events, the initial state, the object's arrival, the resulting change. Third, this pattern needs to be convertible into an image, a mental representation that can be part of the overall thought stream. Fourth, and importantly, this structure needs to send signals back to the object processing areas, modulating their activity and enhancing the object's image. Figure 6.1 gives a very simplified sketch of this idea. Signals coming in, a pattern forming, an image arising, and feedback enhancing the object map. Remember, this is likely a distributed network doing this, not a single box. So, where in the brain might this happen? Forget looking for a single consciousness center. It's more likely an ensemble performance. Think about how you coordinate complex actions, like walking and talking at the same time. It involves multiple motor generators in the brainstem, cerebellum, basal ganglia, etc., all interacting. Consciousness probably works similarly. We need structures that can receive signals from both the proto-self and object maps and also influence those maps. Candidates include the superior colliculi, the cingulate cortex, the thalamus, and some prefrontal areas. The thalamus is a major relay station. The cingulate is heavily involved in emotion and attention, and the colliculi are crucial for orienting responses. It's plausible these structures, perhaps coordinated by the thalamus, work together to create this second-order map. The prefrontal cortex might play a bigger role in the extended consciousness we'll discuss next. What's the point of generating these images of knowing? Two main things. First, the most fundamental, it tells the organism what's going on. It answers the implicit question, what is this relationship between me and this thing? It provides unsolicited knowledge about the situation, which is the beginning of understanding beyond simple reflexes. It allows for planning responses that aren't just pre-programmed instincts. Second, consciousness immediately boosts wakefulness and sharpens attention. When core consciousness arises, it enhances the processing of the object that triggered it. The message seems to be, pay attention to X. This leads to better image processing, optimizing immediate reactions and preparing the organism for future encounters. It's like turning up the volume on the relevant channel and waking yourself up a bit more. Does this only happen with things we see right now? No. Even when we recall something from memory, we still get this core consciousness pulse. Why? Because our memories aren't just static pictures. They store the associated feelings, the bodily reactions, the mental state we were in when we originally encountered the object. So, when we remember, say, a stressful event, our brain reconstructs some of those associated physiological and emotional states. This reconstruction effectively mimics the original interaction, changing the proto-self in much the same way as perceiving the event directly would. The feeling of consciousness is the same, whether you're seeing a bird fly or remembering seeing a bird fly. Even planning an action, like reaching for something, can modify the proto-self and trigger a core consciousness pulse before the action even happens. Planning itself can be a source of these primordial narratives. Now, let's be crystal clear about this narrative idea. We're not talking about sentences or words here. The terms narrative and story are used metaphorically. Think of it as creating a sequence of images, a nonverbal map showing cause and effect, like a silent film or a mime artist telling a story. John Ashbery's line, "This is the tune but there are no words," captures it perfectly. In humans, this underlying nonverbal story is almost instantly translated into language. We narrate our own consciousness in words. This automatic verbal overlay is probably why some people think consciousness is just language commentary. But that's a mistake. Language couldn't exist without this underlying nonverbal process. You can't translate a sentence if the concept doesn't exist first. Think about language itself. Words translate concepts. Concepts are the non-linguistic ideas of things, actions, events. Concepts must precede words. So when you say "I see a car," the word "I" translates the nonverbal concept of yourself, your organism. If that core self weren't already active and generating that feeling of knowing, the word "I" wouldn't make sense. If consciousness depended solely on verbal translation, it would be wildly unpredictable. Creative minds fabricate stories all the time. Healthy humans don't experience consciousness flickering in and out based on their linguistic creativity. Once awake, consciousness stays on. Running out of words doesn't make you unconscious, you just stop speaking. The conclusion is unavoidable. The nonverbal, image narrative is the foundation. The feeling of self and knowing arises from it, and the verbal label comes later as a commentary. This nonverbal storytelling is probably incredibly natural and fundamental. The ability to represent sequences of events as brain maps likely evolved early on. It's the very condition for language. Philosophers puzzle over intentionality. Why are our thoughts always about something? Perhaps the answer lies in this innate storytelling tendency. Our brains are constantly representing the organism and its environment, and naturally weaving these into wordless stories about what's happening to us. It's like the earliest brains were answering Hamlet's famous question, "Who's there?" They had to construct the knowledge of a self, a knower, to even pose the question. The act of knowing had to come first, unsolicited, before we could reflect on it. Let's quickly revisit the infamous homunculus, the little man inside the brain who does the knowing. The idea failed spectacularly because it led to infinite regress. Who knows the little man? Who knows the little man inside the little man? It's absurd. This failure rightly made people wary of locating a simple, centralized knower. But discarding the homunculus shouldn't mean discarding the notion of self altogether. Something like a sense of self is undeniably present. The key insight here is that the core self isn't a pre-existing entity doing the knowing. It's created within the act of knowing, born from the nonverbal narrative itself. You exist as the knower precisely because the story depicts you as the knower. There's no regress because the explanation, the narrative, is presented freely, without needing a higher authority to interpret it. The proto-self is just the stage, not the director. Alright, let's take stock. The core hypothesis is that consciousness relies on a constant, nonverbal story being told internally, a story about how the object is affecting the self. This story manifests as a feeling of knowing and enhances the object's image. Biologically, this involves specific brain structures. We have the proto-self structures, representing the organism, and then a set of second-order structures like the cingulate, thalamus, and colliculi that generate the narrative of the relationship and enhance the object image, possibly via neurotransmitter release and thalamocortical loops. The core self emerges from this integrated pattern. It's a complex distributed operation, involving many brain regions working together to create this moment-to-moment sense of being a knower. Now, let's shift gears to extended consciousness. If core consciousness is the essential engine room, extended consciousness is the grand ship sailing on that sea. It's what we usually mean when we talk about human greatness or distinctiveness in consciousness. EC goes beyond the immediate now. It takes the experiences of core consciousness, seeing a bird, feeling pain, and places them within a vast canvas of past memories and anticipated futures. The self here isn't the fleeting core self, it's the robust autobiographical self, the concept of me grounded in my life story. How does this happen? It relies on three key things. First, the ability to build up autobiographical memory using core consciousness. Second, the ability to treat those memories as objects, reactivating them to generate new core consciousness pulses. Third, the ability to hold all this information, the current object and the autobiographical self, active in working memory for extended periods. So, how does this extended consciousness actually work? It's based on two main tricks. First, the gradual accumulation of autobiographical memories, each one tagged and illuminated by the core consciousness present at the time of the original experience. Second, the clever trick of applying the core consciousness mechanism to these memories themselves. When you recall a memory, it becomes an object, triggering a new pulse of core consciousness, a sense of knowing, alongside whatever else you're currently processing. Working memory holds all these pieces, the current object, the relevant autobiographical fragments, active together for minutes, hours, or even longer. The result? You become aware of a vast panorama of your own existence and knowledge, giving you a sense of perspective, ownership, and agency over that large domain. Importantly, this isn't just intelligence. EC is necessary for intelligence, but it's a distinct phenomenon, relying heavily on working memory. How can we assess this extended consciousness scientifically? Look at the cognitive features. Paying attention to a wide range of information, both external and internal, planning complex actions on over long timescales, and manipulating substantial amounts of recalled knowledge. Behaviorally, actions make sense not just in the immediate moment, but in the context of history and future goals. Interestingly, studies on animals like baboons and chimps suggest similar processes might be at play, hinting at evolutionary roots. We can test for EC by looking at recognition, recall, working memory capacity, emotional depth, and reasoning over time, all in individuals whose core consciousness is functioning normally. Neurology often gives us the clearest insights into these functions. While losing core consciousness wipes out extended consciousness entirely, you can have the opposite, impaired extended consciousness, while core consciousness remains intact. A prime example is transient global amnesia or TGA. It's scary, dramatic, but usually harmless. Someone suddenly loses access to recent autobiographical memories, what happened just before, hours ago, sometimes days ago. They also lose track of their plans for the near future. But here's the kicker. Despite this massive memory wipeout, their core consciousness is fine. They know they're confused. They know what's happening right now. They can follow conversations. They just can't place the current situation in their personal timeline. It's like waking up in a completely unfamiliar room with no idea how you got there or what you're supposed to be doing. The present becomes utterly incomprehensible without the autobiographical context. Let's look at a real case study, a woman who experienced a very mild TGA episode. She was highly educated, normally sharp. Suddenly, she felt unwell, focused intensely on the feeling, closed her eyes, but remained aware of her surroundings. Afterward, she felt warm but couldn't recall asking about the office temperature. Looking at her work, she didn't recognize the manuscript page she was editing. She knew she was editing, but not the specifics. Her calendar names were puzzling. People she'd dealt with recently felt strange. She wrote notes about the episode but couldn't recognize her own words later. Even half an hour later, some names still felt wrong, even after she looked them up. Throughout this, she was perfectly clear about where she was, what she was doing, and who she was. Her core self and core consciousness were untouched, but her access to the autobiographical self was temporarily shattered. So, wrapping up this section, we've seen how core consciousness provides the fundamental, moment-to-moment sense of self and knowing, arising from the brain's nonverbal storytelling about the interaction between the organism and the world. Extended consciousness builds upon this foundation, leveraging autobiographical memory and working memory to create a vast, integrated awareness of our personal history and future, giving us the rich sense of self we associate with being human. They are deeply interdependent, with EC relying on CC for both its immediate functioning and the very memories that constitute it. Understanding this interplay is key to grasping the full spectrum of conscious experience.